The heavy oak doors slammed open. Polished wood and velvet smelled faintly of power and arrogance. Xavier Thorne, the Ice King of Wall Street, laughed, arm draped around Genevieve, scrolling through wedding brochures for a private island. He didn't hear it coming. Naya stepped in. No makeup, no designer labels, just a terracotta dress that flowed like fire against her brown skin. Dark circles under her eyes, a newborn cradled gently in her arms. The room shifted. Xavier's smirk froze. Genevieve's laugh died mid-breath. And in one glance, one silent step, Naya declared war, not with screams, but with truth, courage, and a child who would rewrite everything he thought he owned. Have you ever seen someone you thought you knew completely walk in and destroy your world without saying a word? Watch closely. This is the moment everything changes. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mr. James family. We're so glad you're here because today we've got a story that will grip your heart from the very first second, full of betrayal, revenge, and a mother's courage that changes everything. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our emotional, heart-stopping stories. Trust me, you'll want to watch every single second of this one all the way to the end. Let's get started. The first thing anyone noticed was the sound. Not voices, not laughter. The low, constant hum of the air system, too cold, too controlled, pressing against the skin like a reminder that nothing here was meant to feel human. Xavier Thorne tapped his thumb twice against the crystal glass in his hand. The ice clicked softly, precise, measured. He liked that sound. It reminded him of closing bells and final signatures, of endings that went his way. The velvet sofa beneath him didn't sink. It held firm, like it was trained to. His suit jacket lay perfectly across his shoulders, no wrinkles, no softness. Even sitting still, his body carried the posture of someone used to rooms bending around him. Genevieve's perfume reached him before her voice did. Clean, sharp, expensive. Something with white florals and steel underneath. She leaned into his side, her manicured fingers sliding across his wrist as she scrolled. "Maldives is predictable," she said, tilting the phone so he could see. Her nails clicked lightly against the screen. "Everyone goes there." Xavier didn't look at the photos right away. He watched the reflection of himself in the darkened glass wall opposite them. 33. Still flawless, according to every magazine that had ever asked him to pose. Jaw sharp, hair perfectly disciplined, eyes that never apologized. "I don't repeat what others do," he said finally. Genevieve smiled at that. Not warm, strategic. She liked how that sentence sounded when it came from his mouth. She swiped again. Another island. Another blue that felt staged. "I want something rarer," she said. "Something people can't Google." Xavier took a slow sip of sparkling water. It tasted like nothing, exactly as he preferred. The guards near the door didn't move. Two men, broad shoulders, black suits, no curiosity in their eyes. They were trained to look through people, not at them. Cameras were banned in this lounge. No press, no witnesses. The courthouse had learned long ago how to protect men like Xavier, how to wrap power in privacy and call it procedure. He crossed his leg the other way. The leather of his shoe made a soft sound against the carpet. He noticed everything. He always had. In his mind, the sequence was clean. Naya would walk in late. She always did. Late, hesitant, already apologizing without words. Her eyes would look tired. They had looked tired for years. She would hold herself small, like she still believed space was something she had to earn. She would see Genevieve. She would flinch. That part mattered to him more than he admitted. Then she would sit. She would listen. He would speak gently, like a man doing charity work. He would mention numbers that sounded large to her. He would say things like security and fresh start. She would cry. Quietly. She always cried quietly, like she didn't want to bother anyone with her pain. And then, eventually, she would nod. That was how power worked. You didn't need cruelty when certainty did the job. Genevieve adjusted her posture, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Silk whispered under her palm. She glanced at the doors. "She's late," she said. Xavier checked his watch. He didn't need to, but the gesture pleased him. Time obeyed him. "She'll come," he said. "She has nowhere else to be." Genevieve laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it aligned with what she wanted to believe. Xavier felt the familiar calm settle into his chest. The calm of men who never imagine consequences. His pulse was steady, his breathing even. Somewhere far above in another part of the building, a clock chimed the quarter hour. He counted the seconds between each chime without realizing he was doing it. 23 years earlier, on a rainy October morning in Boston, his father had taught him how to wait without looking impatient. "Silence unnerves people more than threats," he'd said, wiping rainwater from his coat. That lesson had stayed. The doors were still closed. Xavier leaned back further, his arm firm around Genevieve's shoulders, possessive enough to be seen, casual enough to feel earned. He wanted Naya to notice that detail. The ease, the replacement. He imagined the way Naya would lower her eyes when she saw it. The air shifted, not dramatically, just enough. The guards straightened by a fraction. The temperature felt different near the doors, like warmth pressing in from the other side. The hum of the air system deepened, strained slightly. Xavier didn't look up immediately. Then the hinges creaked. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the room. The doors opened, light spilled in first, warmer than the lounge lighting, softer, carrying the faint smell of outside air and something else. Cotton. Old fabric. Memory. Xavier's thumb stopped tapping. Someone stepped forward. He saw movement before he saw her face. Fabric shifting, a slower pace than he expected. Not hesitant, deliberate. Each step placed carefully, like she was testing the ground, but not afraid of it. Genevieve inhaled sharply beside him. Xavier lifted his gaze. For half a second, he didn't recognize her. Not because she looked worse, because she didn't look broken. Naya stood framed by the open doors. No designer coat, no jewelry that carried his name. Her dress was simple, terracotta, soft, moving gently with her breath. The color set her skin alight in a way he'd never noticed before, or maybe had noticed and dismissed. Her hair fell naturally around her shoulders. No effort to tame it, no effort to impress. Her eyes met the room first, not him. She took it in, the guards, the sofa, the woman beside him. Then her gaze dropped to the small bundle in her arms. Xavier's chest tightened before his mind caught up. A baby, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, threadbare at the edges, washed too many times, loved too hard. Naya adjusted her grip instinctively, her hand supporting the tiny back, fingers pressing gently in that unconscious rhythm of someone who had learned another heartbeat. The baby stirred. A soft sound escaped him. Not a cry, just a breath that didn't belong in rooms like this. Xavier felt something cold slide down his spine. Genevieve stood abruptly. Her chair scraped the floor, loud in the quiet. "What is that?" she asked. Naya didn't answer her. She walked forward, each step echoed, muted by carpet, but heavy all the same. The blanket shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of pale skin, a tiny fist, fingers curling, uncurling, searching. Xavier stood halfway, then stopped. The word formed in his throat and died there. Naya reached the chair opposite him and sat down without being asked. The chair creaked. Old wood, honest sound. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the baby again, shielding his face from the cold air. Her movements were practiced, calm. There was no performance in them. "This is Leo," she said. Her voice was softer than the room, but it carried. The baby opened his eyes. Blue. Not Genevieve's sharp blue, not Xavier's polished blue. Something quieter, clearer. Xavier's breath hitched once, barely noticeable, but he felt it. The room didn't hum anymore. It waited. Xavier stared at the child's eyes, a familiar color staring back at him, and for the first time in his life he realized the room had stopped choosing him. The chair made a small sound when Naya sat down, wood adjusting to weight, a quiet complaint. She shifted Leo slightly, tucking the blanket closer to his chin. Her thumb moved in a slow, absent circle against the fabric, the way hands do when they've learned a rhythm from long nights. The faded cloth smelled faintly of laundry soap and something older, sun, maybe, or memory. The baby breathed. That sound, soft, uneven, didn't belong in this room. Xavier noticed that before anything else, before thoughts, before fear. The way the air itself seemed to hesitate, as if the building wasn't sure whether to allow something so fragile inside. Genevieve remained standing. Her heels pressed into the carpet like punctuation marks. She didn't sit back down, didn't cross her arms. Her hands hovered, uncertain, then curled into fists at her sides. "That's—" Xavier tried again. His throat felt tight, like he'd swallowed something dry. His voice came out wrong, too thin, stripped of the weight it usually carried. Naya kept her eyes on Leo. She rocked him once more, barely moving, just enough to remind him she was there. Just enough to remind herself. "This is Leo," she repeated, not louder, not softer, a name spoken without permission. Xavier stared at the baby's face. He told himself it meant nothing. Faces changed. Babies looked like anyone. Still, his chest felt crowded. Genevieve let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had lasted half a second longer. "So," she said, tilting her head, "you brought a prop." Naya's rocking stopped. Not abruptly. Intentionally. She lifted her eyes then, not to Genevieve's face, but to her mouth, to the words still hanging there. "I brought my son," Naya said, no edge, no tremble, just fact. Xavier felt a strange heat crawl up his neck. He cleared his throat and finally straightened fully, standing now because sitting felt wrong. "Naya," he said, trying to place the old tone back into his voice, the one that used to soften her. "This isn't appropriate." The word echoed. Appropriate. Naya glanced at him then, not the way she used to, searching, hopeful, bracing for disappointment. She looked at him the way people look at doors they've already closed. "Neither was locking me out in February," she said quietly. The date landed, cold, specific. Xavier flinched before he could stop himself. It had been snowing that night. He remembered because the city had shut down early, because he'd been annoyed about the traffic. He remembered her knocking, her coat too thin. He remembered deciding not to answer. Genevieve shifted. "You said she left," she snapped. Xavier didn't look at her. Naya adjusted Leo again. His tiny fingers flexed, then caught on the edge of the blanket. She freed them gently, her nails short, unpolished. "I didn't leave," she said. "I was pushed out." Her voice stayed even, but her hand stilled after that, just for a moment, like a skipped breath. Xavier felt the room tilt, not physically, but somewhere behind his eyes. He reached for the glass he'd set down earlier, then realized his hand was shaking. He lowered it instead. "Naya," he said again, slower. "We can discuss arrangements." Arrangements. The word tasted wrong in his mouth. She watched him for a long second. Her gaze dropped briefly, to his cufflinks, to the watch he wore. Then, back to his face. "You still say things like that," she said. "Like people are furniture." Genevieve scoffed. "Don't dramatize," she said. "This is a legal matter." Naya finally looked at her fully then. The silence stretched. "Have you ever held a child at 3 a.m, Naya asked, "and counted your breaths because you're afraid if you fall asleep, everything will fall apart?" She didn't wait for an answer. She looked back down at Leo. Xavier felt the question land on him anyway. He swallowed. Naya reached into her bag, not quickly, not theatrically. Her fingers brushed past a folded piece of paper, a pacifier, a worn sketch pencil. She pulled out nothing, just adjusted the strap and set the bag back down. A nervous habit, he remembered. She used to do that when she was deciding whether to speak. "You don't look like yourself," Xavier said. The sentence slipped out before he could weigh it. Naya almost smiled. "I do," she said. "You just never learned my face without fear on it." That cut deeper than he expected. Genevieve opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to the guards, then back. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. There was no script for this version. Leo stirred again, fussing softly. Naya stood. The movement was slow but decisive. The chair legs scraped lightly as she rose, and the sound made Genevieve flinch. Naya didn't walk away. She didn't leave. She stepped closer, not to Xavier, to the table. She rested her palm on its surface, steadying herself, the other arm secure around her child. The wood felt cool under her skin. Grounding. "I came to sit," she said, "not to beg." Xavier's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what sentence would keep him in control. The baby opened his eyes again. This time, longer. Xavier met them. And something in his stomach dropped, not fear, not yet, but recognition he wasn't ready to name. As Leo's blue eyes locked onto his, Xavier realized the child wasn't just looking at him. He was seeing him. Xavier's hand lingered over the glass, hovering like he could steady himself with it. The ice clinked faintly, a small, brittle sound that made him realize just how quiet the room had become. Every exhale from Naya, every soft shuffle of the baby's blanket carried weight. The calm he relied on seemed fragile, like spun glass. "Well," he said finally, letting his words slide out without the ease they usually held. His eyes flicked to Leo, as if measuring him. Tiny fingers, fragile jaw, a breathing rhythm that seemed impossibly loud in the room's silence. "This changes the number, not the outcome." Genevieve's hand squeezed his arm, approvingly, but the pressure was faint, unsure. She was sensing the shift before she could articulate it, her nails pressing into his sleeve like she was testing the strength of his armor. Xavier nodded toward the table. "Let's be adults. I've prepared a generous settlement." The word settlement tasted off, acrid on his tongue, unfamiliar in this air. He tried to anchor himself with it anyway, trying to remind himself of control. Then Arthur Vance cleared his throat. The sound was soft but sharp, a small blade sliding between heartbeats. Xavier's gaze shifted. The lawyer looked pale, unsteady, fingers trembling as he opened a thick old folder. The leather crackled faintly, like paper, complaining of age and secrets. Xavier noticed, always noticed. It was his skill, reading the details no one else would, the fold of a collar, the tilt of a chair, the pressure someone applied on a pen. "There's something you never saw," Arthur said quietly. His voice was calm, but the room felt heavier with it. "Because your father asked me not to show it, unless today happened." Xavier frowned. "Arthur, don't dramatize." "This isn't drama," the lawyer interrupted. "It's inheritance law." Silence stretched long enough for Xavier to feel the texture of it. It was thick, almost tactile, pressing against his lungs. His pulse ticked somewhere inside his ribs. The baby's soft breathing punctuated it, small and fragile, as if marking the pause in the room's gravity. Genevieve adjusted, her body taut. The smile she had been carrying vanished into a thin line of tension. She could sense the unraveling, though she didn't yet understand the mechanism. Arthur's hands shook slightly as he opened the folder wider. Papers, yellowed edges, legal stamps, the smell of old ink and varnish rose faintly, like a message carried through decades. The room inhaled it with him. Xavier inhaled sharp, trying to memorize every detail, as if control were a scent he could bottle. This is impossible," Xavier said after a pause. His voice was flat but sharp, brittle as fine porcelain. He hadn't yet allowed himself the luxury of fear. Only calculation. Only instinct. Only the rigid assumption that he could twist whatever came next to his favor. Arthur looked at him, eyes steady, and then back at the folder. "Your father wanted to make sure no one could touch the empire unless the proper conditions were met. The conditions are specific." Xavier's smirk began. That smirk, the one that had carried him through boardrooms and lawsuits and every personal battle for decades, hovered on his face for a fraction of a second. He thought he had this. He thought he could reclaim this room before it even realized it was tilting. Genevieve shifted. Her body mirrored his confidence, but it was already showing cracks. "What conditions?" Xavier asked, tone clipped, eyes still flicking toward Naya and the baby, measuring, calculating, hunting for any leverage. Arthur inhaled slowly. "Your father's will states that the Thorn Empire can only pass to a man married to the mother of his firstborn child." The words landed like stones dropped into the water. Small waves at first, then rippling into every corner of the room. Xavier blinked. The smirk faltered. One corner of his mouth quivered like a fuse before a spark. The weight of those words pressed down, heavier than anything he had encountered, and yet, impossibly, the world continued. Air systems hummed, the carpet pressed against his shoes, the baby breathed, all ordinary and lethal at the same time. Genevieve gasped, barely audible, but it sounded like a thunderclap in Xavier's ears. He turned, trying to maintain authority, trying to mask the unease, but his hands twitched, fingers brushing the table's surface, seeking something firm to hold on to. Confidence that used to radiate like heat now felt like a candle flickering in a storm. Arthur's voice cut into the rising chaos. "It's not negotiable. The board has already signed off. They accepted this when your father passed." Xavier opened his mouth. Words failed him. His mind raced, recalling every strategic move he had made in the last 5 years, every merger, acquisition, every handshake that had been a silent countdown to his control of the empire. All of it now teetered on a clause he had never imagined would exist, a clause he had never read, a clause that now made him fragile. You're joking," he said, low, measured, but shaking internally, not his voice, his mind. He could hear the betrayal in it. He had always thought inheritance was his to command, the empire a set of dominoes aligned by his hands, not a puzzle he could lose in a single breath. Arthur's gaze remained calm, unwavering. No joke. Legal, binding, and irrevocable. Genevieve's face went pale. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. She had only imagined victory here, a scene scripted in her favor. Now the narrative had shifted. She didn't know the ending yet, but she could feel the loss approaching, tangible and cold. The baby stirred, a small movement. Leo's tiny hand brushed the edge of the blanket. Innocent, small, real, unmovable by Xavier's schemes, the stark contrast between his predictable world and the unpredictability of this child made the billionaire's pulse jump in ways he had never felt. A tightness in his chest, a hollow he hadn't known existed, opened inside him. Xavier's throat worked. He wanted to command the room. He wanted to assert control. He wanted to turn the lawyer, the fiancé, and the child into pieces of the same predictable game board he had always won at. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't a game. Not today. Not like this. This cannot, he began again. He paused. His voice cracked just slightly, betraying what his face refused to admit. Naya's presence, calm, deliberate, unyielding, cut through all his rehearsed maneuvers. She wasn't angry, she wasn't weak, she simply existed. A stillness that didn't answer his challenge, but dismantled it. Genevieve's lips quivered. He can't lose everything over this, she said, a plea disguised as accusation. Xavier took a step forward, almost instinctively, reaching for leverage, for argument, for something to twist. He had always been able to dominate a room. Always. Not now. Not this time. The room had shifted allegiance, the air had changed weight, and a clause written decades ago now governed every move he thought he controlled. Arthur closed the folder gently. The soft crackle of aged leather was like a period ending a sentence Xavier hadn't wanted to hear. Silence swallowed the space between them. The baby yawned, a fragile motion that seemed to underscore the impossibility of the billionaire's position. Xavier's mind raced for alternatives, possibilities, loopholes. Nothing fit. Every strategy felt like smoke slipping through fingers. His body tensed, shoulders coiled, ready for confrontation. Yet internally he felt unarmed in a way he had never known. The smirk that had carried him for years faltered completely. Confidence, once a shield, now threatened to betray him. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the realization that he could lose irrevocably left a hollow echo in his chest. He looked at Naya. Her back was straight, her eyes were calm. The baby safe in her arms. No pleading, no performance, just reality. A simple, devastating reality he hadn't accounted for. For the first time, the Ice King of Wall Street considered a future in which he wasn't untouchable, in which his name, his empire, his control were no longer absolute. The thought alone made his throat tighten. Xavier's hand hovered over the folder, trembling slightly as Arthur's eyes met his. And in that frozen second, he realized everything he had built could slip away before he even uttered a single word. Arthur's fingers lingered on the edge of the folder as he slid it across the table. The paper made a faint rasp, a dry whisper that seemed to stretch the silence. It landed squarely between Xavier and Naya, almost as if it were alive, waiting to be acknowledged. Xavier's eyes followed it with automatic precision. His instincts were trained to see threats, to calculate angles, to anticipate movement. But the stillness of the paper unsettled him. A single sheet, yellowed, crisp at the edges, yet somehow heavier than any ledger he had ever held. "Your father added a clause to the Thorne estate," Arthur said. His voice was low, deliberate, and carried a weight Xavier could feel in his chest. It states that the empire may only pass to a man who is legally married to the mother of his firstborn child. The words fell into the room and settled like stones in a pond. The air thickened. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to hush, the temperature shifting minutely, pressing against skin and suit fabric alike. Xavier laughed. Just once. Sharp, brittle, too loud for the space. The sound carried all the wrong confidence, the fake kind. Genevieve's eyes darted to him, searching for reassurance, but found only tremor beneath the practiced veneer. Then he read. The ink was dark, clear, immutable, and the color left his face in waves, a pale rush that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. He blinked slowly. His pulse ticked faster than the hum of the air system. That's not enforceable, he whispered, voice tight, a fraction of panic threading through his control. He glanced at Genevieve, then Arthur, as if either might be lying, but Arthur's calm, steady gaze offered no mercy. It already has been, Arthur replied. Your board signed off years ago. It's legally binding. It's irrevocable. The words landed like iron in water, heavy, unmovable. The solidity of them pressed against Xavier's ribs, constricting. The empire he had imagined as untouchable suddenly felt precarious, fragile, dependent on a clause buried decades before he had been capable of understanding consequences. Genevieve's hands rose instinctively, as though she could physically stop the document from existing. Her voice trembled. This is insane. Fix it. Fix it now. Arthur shook his head. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but absolute. If the divorce is finalized today, Mr. Thorne loses control of everything. Company, assets, name, nothing remains in your possession legally. Not a single asset. The board has no discretion here. Xavier turned slowly to Naya. His gaze swept over her. Not at her face first, but at the curve of her back, the angle of her shoulders, the way she held Leo, arms steady, posture unyielding. For the first time, fear threaded through his voice. Naya, we can talk. Her eyes flicked toward him, calm, intentional, a measured look that weighed years of betrayal and neglect against a single moment. The room shrank to a point where only she and the baby existed, the empire and its claims suspended in invisible air. Xavier swallowed. His throat felt constricted, as if the words he needed were barred. His mind, trained to calculate outcomes instantly, froze. He realized every option he had relied on was now irrelevant. There were no boards to manipulate, no contracts to bend, no charm to deploy. The baby stirred slightly, a soft sigh, tiny fingers flexing against the blanket. Leo's presence became a reminder of the consequences Xavier had never wanted to face, the consequences Arthur's words had crystallized. Genevieve stepped forward, voice high, strained. You can't let this happen. This is your empire. It belongs to you. Xavier raised a hand, signaling for silence, but the gesture felt hollow. No authority emanated from it, no room bent to his will anymore. Naya shifted Leo slightly, pressing a thumb against his cheek. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but it cut sharper than any accusation. You always thought the world could be bought, Xavier, that people, moments and lives could be arranged like chess pieces, but life doesn't obey your ledger. The calm in her tone was like ice sliding over his nerves. Each word, a small fracture in the armor he had worn for decades. Xavier took a step forward, hesitant. Words formed, faltered, failed. This, we can reconsider. There must be... Arthur's hand pressed down lightly on the folder. There's nothing to reconsider. Every condition has been met, legally, authentically, without exception. Xavier's mind raced. He considered bribery, manipulation, threats. The legacy of the Thorn name felt tangible. Suddenly malleable in memory, but immutable on paper. The paperwork itself, yellowed and ordinary, was more powerful than any court or boardroom he had ever dominated. He glanced at Genevieve. Her hands trembled. Her face was pale, lips pressed tight. She was used to outcomes bending to favor her and him. Now she felt the weight of a future she couldn't buy, couldn't influence. Xavier's gaze returned to Naya. Not pleading, not angry, just composed, observing. And the silence between them grew heavy, almost visible, stretching to the corners of the lounge, wrapping around the guards, the furniture, the faint smell of polished wood and cold air. For the first time in his life, the Ice King considered that some things were beyond control. That empire, power, wealth, each could be stripped by the simple, elegant rules set long before his ambition had learned to bend them. He opened his mouth again. Words were failing him. Each syllable sounded wrong, hollow. He felt a tightening behind his eyes, a pressure that threatened to leak, uncontainable. The baby's breath hitched, Leo's tiny fist flexed. A sound, soft, intimate, terrifyingly human, something Xavier had never confronted, life beyond calculation, love beyond ownership. He looked at the document again, legal, binding, absolute. The clause, something he had never imagined, buried in language written by a father long gone, was the pivot point of his entire existence. Xavier exhaled slowly. The weight of every decision he had made, every manipulation, every calculated move over the years pressed down. The room no longer obeyed him. He realized the empire he had built, every merger, acquisition, contract, handshake, was now a castle built on sand. One letter of law, one clause in ink had shifted the foundation entirely. Genevieve moved closer. "There must be a way," she began, but her words felt small, childish, impotent in the space where Naya and Leo existed. Xavier's fingers flexed. He wanted to grab, to strike, to speak with the certainty he had always wielded. He wanted to reclaim control, but the thought faltered before it fully formed. The baby stirred again, a subtle, measured movement. Naya's hand brushed over his head, protective, precise. Xavier's pulse caught. He realized with a cold clarity that this child, this small, vulnerable human being, was now the center of every consequence he could no longer command. He took another step forward, voice low, controlled. "We can talk." But even as he spoke, the knowledge settled deeper. Some things aren't meant to be bargained. Some moments strip power faster than armies, contracts, or threats ever could. Naya's gaze remained steady. No expression, no pleading. Just the quiet assertion that reality finally was hers to hold. The room seemed to lean in. Every breath, every shuffle, every faint creak of the floor became a punctuation mark on the sentence that had begun years before, now ready to conclude in a way Xavier had never foreseen. He swallowed. The empire, the legacy, the name. All of it felt suddenly irrelevant. All that mattered was the clause, the law, and the child who embodied it. Xavier's smirk, the armor he had always worn, wavered and fell away completely. Xavier's eyes locked on Naya, and for the first time he realized the clause didn't just threaten his empire, it threatened his identity, his legacy, and the illusions he had built around his life. The silence that followed was heavier than any courtroom, colder than any winter, and he knew he might have already lost everything. Xavier's knees hit the carpet first. The faint scrape echoed in the quiet lounge like a gunshot, sharp and undeniable. Every second he remained there, his tailored suit pressed into the plush carpet, reminded him how fragile his control had become. Hands that had once closed billion-dollar deals now hovered uncertainly over Naya's, seeking purchase, seeking mercy. "I was wrong," he said quickly, the words tumbling out like stones off a cliff. I was under pressure. Genevieve was a business decision. You know me. You know my heart." His voice cracked once on the word heart. He hadn't intended it, but the emotions slipped, a tremor revealing what he thought he had buried beneath decades of precision. He reached for Naya's hand, palm open, as if she were a ledger he could claim, a contract he could sign with a touch. She pulled back, gently, not harshly, not angrily, just enough to protect Leo, to maintain the small distance that kept her grounded. Her brown skin glowed softly under the overhead lights, every movement calm, deliberate, like water folding over rocks. The baby stirred in her arms, a quiet murmur, and she shifted slightly to shield him. Every micro-motion said the same thing. "I will not break for you." Genevieve exploded beside him, a sharp, metallic sound of frustration that cut through the room like shattered glass. "You can't be serious. You said you never loved her. You does. You said it." Xavier's gaze flicked toward her, a spasm of annoyance mingled with fear crossing his features. He wanted to snap, to declare dominance, to remind her of every luxury, every power they had amassed together, but the words lodged in his throat. Arthur Vance shifted slightly, his fingers folded over each other, a subtle display of unease. For the first time, the lawyer seemed human, vulnerable even, witness to a moment bigger than precedent or paperwork. He avoided Xavier's gaze, looking down at the folder he had laid on the table, as if the weight of the claws he carried could crush him too. Naya's eyes returned to Xavier's. She held his gaze without accusation, without anger. Distance stretched between them, vast and undeniable, yet there was something softer underneath. Pity. Recognition of a man who had once been untouchable, now reduced to vulnerability before what he had overlooked, the consequences of his choices. Xavier swallowed. The silence was heavy, tactile, pressing against his chest. He realized that this gesture, kneeling, begging, had no precedent in his life. No victory could follow it. Only hope. And hope was fleeting. He shifted slightly, bringing his hands closer to her, not touching, only hovering. "Please, listen to me. Everything I did, it was calculated, yes. But it was never about taking from you, never about taking from Leo. He faltered. The words tangled in the gravity of her calm, the presence of the child, the cold authority of the claws that had just overturned his life. Naya adjusted Leo again. Tiny hands flexed against the blanket. The baby cooed softly. She tilted her head, observing Xavier's trembling, the desperation he carried like a second skin. "You are learning something," she said softly, voice steady, controlled. "Not about me. Not about Leo. About yourself." Xavier's pulse jumped. He hadn't expected that. He had rehearsed every possible reaction, anger, negotiation, fear, but not this quiet indictment, not this calm analysis of the man he had always believed himself to be. Genevieve's breathing quickened, sharp and uneven. "How can you just sit there and he's begging you, and you're calm? How is this possible?" Naya didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her calmness spoke volumes, louder than Xavier's pleading ever could. The power had shifted. The room recognized it. Even the guards, still like statues near the doors, seemed to hold their breath, sensing the unusual balance. Xavier's hands dropped slightly, his knees dug deeper into the carpet. He tried another angle. I can make this right. I can financially, legally, everything can be restored. Please." The word please slipped past his lips unguarded, unstrategized. It was a sound foreign to him, raw, human, vulnerable. Naya's eyes softened fractionally, not in acceptance but in recognition that the man kneeling before her was still the man who had built an empire, yet completely powerless against the truth he had ignored for too long. "Do you think money can fix this?" she asked, voice low, careful, every syllable deliberate. "Do you think empire, or wealth, or contracts can heal the years you spent making me invisible?" Xavier's mouth opened, then closed. Words failed, strategy failed, even the rehearsed charm, the smiles, the calculated pauses. Nothing worked. Genevieve's hands flew to her mouth, trying to contain her disbelief. He's pathetic," she hissed, but her voice carried the tremor of fear. Fear not for herself, but for the loss of the life she had imagined, built, expected. Arthur shifted again, clearing his throat softly. "Mr. Thorne, this demonstration of emotion—" He stopped, realizing words were futile. The moment existed beyond law, beyond contracts. It existed in the room, in the tension, in the air between past and present. Xavier tried again, softer, slower. "Naya, I never meant to—" She interrupted lightly, holding up a hand, careful, protective over Leo. "Stop. Not because I don't hear you, but because I do. And what I hear doesn't make me forgive. It only makes me understand." Her calmness was a mirror, reflection of every misstep, every cruelty, every neglect, and it cut through the suit he wore like a knife. Xavier's head bowed slightly. The suit now felt like armor he'd outgrown, no longer functional, only decorative. The empire behind him, the contracts around him, the wealth he had accumulated. It all seemed like a memory of another life. Leo yawned, tiny, delicate, utterly human. The sound punctuated the room, a heartbeat of life beyond calculation. Xavier looked at the baby, and for the first time he saw consequence incarnate, small, pure, undeniable. Naya's gaze never left him. Pity, yes, but also a quiet authority. Power stripped of arrogance, control manifested in calm, deliberate presence. Xavier reached once more, hesitant. The air in the room was thick, almost tactile, carrying years of regret, fear, and unrealized longing. Genevieve cried out, words trembling. "You can't, he can't, he's—" But Xavier heard only the soft voice of Naya, speaking to him across the space that years had created between them. A voice that held truth he could no longer manipulate. "You are learning," she said again, "that some things cannot be bought, cannot be coerced, cannot be forced, not by power, not by wealth, not by charm." Xavier's chest tightened. His mind whirred, thoughts colliding. The room pressed in. He realized his empire, his name, his legacy, all fragile, fleeting, dependent on factors he could never fully command. He knelt there, still, defenseless, facing a reality he had refused to imagine. His hands hovered above hers again, tentative, powerless. Every instinct screamed to regain control. Every lesson, every strategy, every negotiation tactic, useless. Naya adjusted Leo, smooth and protective, entirely unshaken by his display. The room waited. The air itself seemed suspended, caught between past arrogance and the quiet lesson unfolding in front of them. And in that silence, Xavier understood something fundamental. He could beg. He could plead. He could manipulate and strategize, but he could not reclaim what he had never truly earned. Xavier's eyes locked on Naya's, and for the first time he realized that this was not about forgiveness, not about money, not about legacy. It was about a choice she had already made, one he could not undo, no matter how desperately he pleaded. Naya reached into her bag with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing over worn notebooks, a pacifier, and a folded blanket, before closing around a second folder. The motion was casual, almost mundane, but the weight it carried was palpable. The air in the room thickened, heavy with anticipation, like the moment just before a storm breaks. She placed the folder on the table with care. A soft thud sounded, as if the paper itself were laying down judgment. Divorce papers, already signed, but that wasn't all. Arthur's breath caught. His eyes widened ever so slightly, and his hand hovered over the folder. The crease of his brow deepened, a subtle tremor in his jaw betraying the immovable surprise he had been trained to hide. "Renunciation of lineage," he whispered, voice barely above a sigh, and the words hung in the air like smoke curling around a flame. Xavier froze mid-step, the smug confidence that had carried him through boardrooms, contracts, and every personal conquest evaporating instantly. His hand hovered uselessly over the folder, not daring to touch it. "You wouldn't," he whispered, disbelief threading through every syllable. Naya leaned closer, but only just enough for her voice to carry with low, measured finality. "You spent years making me feel invisible because of my skin and my silence," she said. Her gaze swept over him, then softened fractionally as it returned to the child in her arms. "Now I'm making you invisible to your son." She looked down at Leo. The baby's soft breathing, the tiny curl of his fist, the slight tremor of his eyelids as he slept, all of it anchored the moment in brutal, undeniable reality. "He won't carry your name. He won't inherit your poison." Xavier's chest tightened. Breath caught. His world, meticulously constructed, crumbled around him in real time. He was a man who had built empires, negotiated wars in boardrooms, and bent the most powerful men in the world to his will. And now, stripped to knees and raw emotion, he was powerless in the face of a piece of paper and the woman holding the future he never anticipated. Genevieve stepped forward, but the words caught in her throat. Her face was pale, lips parted, eyes wide with horror and disbelief. "You can't, he can't." Naya didn't flinch. She placed a gentle hand over Leo's head, protective, resolute. Her calmness carried the gravity of decisions made, of power reclaimed, of truth laid bare. "He can," she said simply, "because it's not just the law, it's the choice of a mother." Xavier's knees dug deeper into the carpet. He reached out, shaking slightly as if touching her could erase what had been done. His hands hovered over hers, over the papers, over the life he had imagined for himself. The suits, the contracts, the empire, all were meaningless in the face of her deliberate resolve. Arthur cleared his throat, breaking the charged silence. "Mr. Thorne, the document is binding. There is no reversal without the mother's consent." His voice carried weight, but even he seemed swallowed by the tension, as if the room itself demanded attention. The air was thick. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the last. The soft rustle of papers, the faint creak of a chair, the subtle hum of the HVAC. It all felt magnified, a chorus underscoring the power dynamic now firmly shifted. Xavier's mind raced. Every strategy he had rehearsed, pleas, bribery, manipulation, threats, now seemed pathetic, irrelevant. He had been the Ice King of Wall Street, untouchable, untarnished, and now, kneeling on the carpet, all he could feel was the hollowness of expectation meeting reality. He tried to speak again, voice low, desperate. "Naya, we can negotiate, we can—" She shook her head slowly, a motion precise and calm, deliberate in its weight. "There is nothing to negotiate. You've spent years using your charm, your wealth, your influence to erase me. Leo deserves something you cannot buy, something you cannot control." The baby stirred slightly, flexing tiny fingers against the faded blanket, eyes fluttering open. The blue of them, bright and innocent, mirrored Xavier's own, a cruel reminder of what he had lost before he even realized it. Genevieve's breath caught audibly. She looked at Xavier as if pleading for action, as if her presence could alter the inevitability of what was unfolding. But Xavier knew she could not. No one could. He reached for the papers again, trembling, his mind a storm of disbelief. You're serious? All of this? Irrevocable? Naya's gaze held firm. Yes, irrevocable, because some lessons aren't learned until they're felt. She leaned slightly closer, just enough for the weight of her presence to land. This is about justice, Xavier, not punishment. About the life that belongs to my child, not to your ambitions. The Ice King's shoulders slumped, a subtle collapse that betrayed years of pride. His mind ran through options, escape routes, ultimatums, every tactic he had ever employed in boardrooms or bedrooms. Nothing remained viable. He was outmaneuvered, outclassed, exposed by a single act of resolve that carried decades of suppressed truth. Arthur's eyes softened as he glanced at Naya, then back to Xavier. The lawyer's usual composure was tempered by the understanding that power was not always in control. It was sometimes in the choice of restraint, in deliberate action that altered the course of lives. Xavier's voice cracked slightly as he whispered, I never imagined you could do this. She tilted her head, looking at him without anger, without malice, just the calm assertion of authority. You never imagined because you never had to imagine, you never asked. The room seemed to shrink around them, the furniture and walls pressing close, witnesses to a reversal that no one could deny. Every subtle sound, the baby's breath, the rustle of paper, a faint cough from Genevieve, punctuated the severity of the moment. Xavier's chest tightened. He tried to find his usual armor of confidence, of arrogance, but it was gone, evaporated by the weight of choice, by the presence of truth, by the undeniable act of renunciation before him. The folder sat heavy on the table, a physical manifestation of all that he had lost and all that he could never reclaim. Naya adjusted Leo in her arms, the gentle motion deliberate, protective, final. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, met Xavier's one last time across the divide of years and betrayal. He realized fully that the life he had imagined, the control he had relied on, the legacy he had clung to, none of it mattered in the face of what she had decided for her child. Every heartbeat seemed amplified in his chest. Every breath tasted sharp, metallic, like the first cold gust of winter wind. The empire he had built, the wealth he had amassed, the arrogance he had wielded, they all crumbled into irrelevance before the quiet authority of a mother's decision. He sank further into the carpet, palms resting uselessly beside the folder. Words failed. Strategies failed. Pleas failed. All that remained was the quiet truth laid bare by a hand steady enough to hold a newborn and a mind deliberate enough to wield justice without vengeance. Even Genevieve recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips, realizing that no charm, no wealth, no negotiation could alter the course set by Naya's unyielding resolve. Xavier's throat moved. He wanted to speak, to argue, to claim something, anything, but he found himself unable. The reality was too sharp, too immediate, too undeniable. He looked down at the baby again, tiny blue eyes, innocent, unclaimed by the name he had once assumed would carry power. The renunciation was complete. The papers were signed. The life of the child, his own son, was now outside the reach of his empire. Silence fell. Heavy. Absolute. Every heartbeat, every exhale, every faint rustle of fabric seemed magnified in the room. The world, as he knew it, had been recalibrated by a simple, deliberate choice. Xavier's knees pressed into the carpet, hands resting uselessly by his sides. He realized fully that this was a defeat not of power or wealth, but of arrogance, of years of underestimating the resilience and wisdom of the woman he had tried to control. He swallowed hard. The empire, the legacy, the illusions, they were gone, stripped away by a folder, by intention, by resolve. Xavier's eyes darted between Naya and the papers, and in that suspended moment, he realized something that made his stomach twist. He hadn't just lost control of his empire. He might have lost the very identity he had built his life around. The doors opened silently, without announcement, almost imperceptibly, and a man stepped into the lounge. Tall, broad-shouldered, calm. His presence carried a weight that didn't demand attention but commanded it, the kind of quiet authority that made every instinct in the room pause. Arthur shifted slightly, then gestured toward him. "This is Marcus Hale," he said, voice low, measured, deliberate, CEO of Halewell Industries. Xavier stiffened immediately. The name alone was a jolt. A reminder of every boardroom battle, every acquisition attempt, every underhanded negotiation he had waged over the last decade. Marcus was not just a rival. He was the man who had always been one step ahead, who had taken deals from under Xavier's nose without leaving fingerprints. Marcus's gaze swept across the room, and when it landed on Naya, he inclined his head respectfully. No bow, no exaggerated gesture, just a subtle acknowledgement of authority. "Everything's ready," he said, voice deep, calm, carrying the weight of preparation and promise. Genevieve's reaction was instantaneous, a sharp, piercing scream, loud enough to echo off the polished walls and reflect off the velvet furniture. "You planned this!" she shouted, incredulous, her fingers trembling in mid-air as if she might physically grab the answer from Naya's calm composure. Naya rose slowly, her motion precise and unhurried. Every eye in the room tracked her, every breath seemed to hitch in response to her deliberate authority. "Yes," she said softly. Her voice was quiet, measured, final, but every syllable carried the gravity of a storm long held back. "While you were choosing islands," she continued, eyes flicking to Xavier, "I was choosing freedom." The necklace around her neck caught the light briefly, and a small, almost imperceptible blink of a red indicator drew Xavier's attention. A recording device. Xavier's pulse spiked. He took an involuntary step backward. His mind raced, trying to calculate, trying to predict. Every instinct screamed for control, for damage control, for an escape from this reality that was unraveling faster than he could grasp. Genevieve's scream caught in her throat, her face drained of color. How could you?" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing that any protest now would only underscore her helplessness in the room. Marcus didn't flinch. He remained still, calm, surveying the scene like an observer who had predicted every move. His presence amplified the tension, a silent promise that the room's power dynamics had shifted completely. Naya's gaze met Xavier's. Not pleading, not angry, calm, commanding. "You built your life around control," she said. Her voice was low but clear, resonant. "I built mine around survival and preparation. Every time you believed you had the upper hand, I was planning this moment." Xavier's knees threatened to buckle, though he remained standing, his hands flexed at his sides, a subconscious gesture of power that no longer carried weight. The empire he had taken for granted seemed distant, irrelevant, now reduced to paper, threat, and whispered secrets. Arthur stepped closer, folder in hand, eyes scanning the room cautiously. He had been a loyal observer, a protector of the law and order Xavier had relied on, yet even he now recognized that what Naya had orchestrated was beyond standard procedure. It was not law, it was precision, patience, and strategy combined. Leo stirred again in Naya's arms, tiny fingers curling slightly, as if sensing the tension, the unspoken threat, the presence of men and power that had dominated rooms like this before. Naya adjusted him gently, protective, grounding, reminding everyone of what truly mattered in the room. The child. Xavier's voice came out hoarse, cracking under the pressure of realization. What? What have you done? His words were less a question than a recognition of power shifted. Naya smiled faintly, but it was not warmth. It was the acknowledgement of inevitability. I've done what you never allowed me to do. I've taken back control of my life and ensured a future for Leo that you cannot corrupt. Marcus stepped slightly forward, offering a single folder to Naya, who accepted it without a word. The folder's contents remained hidden to Xavier, but the gesture alone carried implications of support, preparation, and coordination that he had failed to anticipate. Genevieve's hands went to her face. You colluded with him, with Marcus. How could... Naya cut her off with a single calm gesture, raising a hand briefly. I didn't collude, she said. I prepared. Marcus is here because he respects boundaries. He doesn't need to manipulate or threaten. He simply ensures what I have decided comes to fruition without interference. Xavier's mind raced. Every calculation, every scenario he had imagined crumbled. The clause, the renunciation, the recording, and now a man he had long feared professionally was silently backing the woman he had sought to control personally. He tried to regain composure. This isn't fair. You can't... Naya's gaze fixed on him, unwavering. Fairness is a concept for those who have never had to survive in the shadow of someone else's empire. This, she said, tapping the papers on the table lightly, is reality. My reality. Leo's reality. And it will be respected. The room felt smaller. The walls, the furniture, the polished wood and air, all seemed to lean inward, compressing Xavier's world into the undeniable fact that he had been outmaneuvered at every turn he had thought was under his control. Even the guards shifted slightly, sensing the absolute authority in the space. Not Naya's physicality, but the orchestration of her presence, her calm, her preparation. The Ice King had never faced a situation where every variable had been anticipated, every move countered, every leverage point neutralized. Xavier's chest tightened, a physical reaction to the realization of irreversible loss. His mind tried to scramble, to calculate, to regain any semblance of influence, but there was nothing, only observation, recognition, and fear. He noticed the subtle flicker of the recording device again. That single red light blinked steadily, a silent witness to everything he had said, every manipulation he had admitted, every revelation that now existed in unalterable form. Genevieve took a hesitant step back, glancing between Marcus and Naya. She realized the reality she had tried to ignore. Power had shifted beyond money, influence, or strategy. It had shifted to preparation, patience, and deliberate resolve. Xavier opened his mouth to speak again. The words were trapped, struggling against the weight of inevitability. Marcus remained still, silent, unthreatening in presence, but undeniable in effect. One man, calm, deliberate, yet a symbol of all that Xavier had underestimated. Naya adjusted Leo in her arms again, a simple gesture that grounded the room. She tapped the necklace once, and the small red light blinked again. Xavier's pulse thundered. He realized fully that every conversation, every negotiation, every tactic had been recorded, every word captured. Nothing could be retracted, nothing could be controlled. The gravity of the moment hit him. He had underestimated Naya at every turn. Not her love, not her patience, not her resilience, but her capacity for strategy, foresight, and deliberate action. Arthur looked on, finally letting out a soft exhale. He recognized the end of an era, a collapse of a long-held illusion, a restructuring of the natural order within the room. The child, unaware, yawned, a tiny coo escaping his lips, a sound so human, so innocent, that it resonated in the stillness like a bell in a cathedral. Xavier's knees felt weak. His empire, his pride, his identity, stripped by law, choice, and calculated human intelligence. He looked at Naya again. Her gaze was calm, absolute, certain, a woman who had built a plan in silence, hidden behind the curtain of her patience, her intellect, and her resolve. Xavier realized, horrified, that this was the moment he had never prepared for. He had always anticipated moves from rivals, but never foresight from the woman he had underestimated the most. As Naya tapped her necklace one final time, the red light blinking steadily, Xavier understood, in a single, gut-wrenching moment, every word he had spoken, every secret, every confession, was now in the hands of someone who would use it, and nothing in his empire could protect him from the consequences. Arthur's hand hovered over the console for a moment, the faint click of the play button sounding louder than the hum of the room. He pressed it, and suddenly the silence was filled with Xavier's voice, cold, calculated, cruel, each syllable sharp, precise, meant to wound, to manipulate. "I'm only marrying Genevieve for the merger. Naya is temporary." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The sound bounced off the walls, reverberating in every corner of the VIP lounge, turning polished wood and velvet into witnesses of betrayal. Xavier froze, mid-gesture, his mouth half open as if trying to reclaim control. He realized too late that the power of his voice, the very weapon he had wielded for years, was now turned against him. The baby stirred in Naya's arms. Leo's tiny eyes blinked open, still half dreaming, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Naya adjusted him slightly, rocking him gently, her calm demeanor contrasting the chaos that Xavier's own words had created. Genevieve's lips trembled. She had expected revelations, yes, but not the stark exposure of cold calculation. Her face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as if the room itself had siphoned it away. Arthur's voice broke the weighty silence. "One more thing." He paused, letting the tension thicken, letting the echoes of Xavier's own admissions seep into every corner. Xavier's eyes flicked toward him. "What? What now?" His voice was tighter, harder, laced with tension but stripped of the usual arrogance, his usual confidence. The shield that had carried him through decades of negotiations, betrayals, and boardroom wars was cracking. Arthur opened a thin folder, a small stack of documents held carefully between fingers that trembled faintly. "The paintings that made you millions?" he asked softly, directing his gaze at Xavier. "They don't belong to you." Xavier blinked. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What do you mean? They belong to Naya," Arthur said. His words were deliberate, each syllable carrying proof, precision, authority. "She created them. The records, the sketches, the original canvases. We have documentation, signed and verifiable." The air shifted. The faint scent of polished wood and leather mingled with the metallic tang of tension. Xavier's hands, usually steady, flexed involuntarily, pressing against his knees as he sank slightly into the velvet sofa. Genevieve staggered back a step, trying to comprehend the immensity of the revelation. "No, that's impossible. You can't—" Naya raised a hand gently, not in defense but in acknowledgement of the truth that had been concealed for years. "It's not impossible," she said softly. "It's reality. Reality you refuse to see, Xavier." The baby yawned. Tiny fingers flexed against the faded blue blanket. The innocence in that gesture was almost blinding. Here was life untouched by lies, untouched by arrogance, untouched by a father's obsession with control. Xavier's chest tightened. He tried to form words, but the weight of exposure left him mute. He had built his empire on appearances, on negotiation, on manipulation, on talent he had claimed as his own. And now, all of it lay bare. He looked at the paintings that hung on the walls of his office, visual trophies of wealth, proof of status, symbols of intellect and taste. He realized they were not his, not by creation, not by right. They were hers, Naya's genius masked by his ego, appropriated by his ambition. Arthur's gaze softened. "It's not just the art, Mr. Thorne," he said quietly, almost gently. "It's everything that comes with it. Reputation, profit, legacy. You claimed it, but legally, ethically, it's hers." Xavier's hands trembled slightly. He tried to stand, tried to assert himself, but the weight of realization held him down. His empire, his pride, his legacy, pieces of it were built on borrowed brilliance, appropriated creativity, and now it all came crashing down. Genevieve's eyes darted between Xavier and Naya. She had believed herself secure in the arrangement, a planned marriage, a calculated move for power and wealth. But now, all that certainty had evaporated. She could see the true shift. Xavier's empire had been hollow, and the woman she had underestimated was its rightful master. Naya adjusted Leo, rocking him gently, a mother's rhythm marking each passing second, each revelation. Her voice remained steady, measured. "This is the truth," she said, "and it cannot be erased, just as Leo's future cannot be rewritten by your ego." Xavier pressed a hand to his forehead. The velvet of the sofa pressed against his palms, grounding him, but it offered no solace. Every strategy, every negotiation, every plan to regain control had failed. The walls around him were closing in, not physically, but morally, emotionally, strategically. Marcus Hale observed quietly, leaning against the wall with an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. His presence was calm, non-threatening, yet carried undeniable weight. He was the silent enforcer of consequence, a reminder that the world was wider than Xavier's office, wider than his ambitions. Arthur moved slightly, shuffling papers. The evidence was irrefutable. Every ledger, every signature, every record was there, documented meticulously, confirming Naya's authorship of the artwork that had defined Xavier's public identity. Xavier's voice was hoarse when it finally emerged. I thought. His sentences broke apart. The carefully constructed armor of pride shattered into fragments of disbelief, rage, and fear. Naya's gaze remained unflinching. She had anticipated his reactions, the range of emotion, the desperation, but she remained calm, measured. Every micro-expression on her face communicated certainty, resolve, authority. The baby's eyes flickered open, catching Xavier's own blue gaze. There was no recognition, no fear, only presence, small and pure. And in that glance, Xavier understood in a visceral way that his son was untouched by his ego, untouched by his legacy, untouched by the artifice that had defined Xavier's life. Genevieve finally sank into a chair, her fingers trembling. She had witnessed the collapse of not only a man's pride, but also the illusion of control she had counted on for security, for status, for ambition. Xavier sank back, his mind spinning. For decades, he had believed himself untouchable. He had manipulated, controlled, and coerced. But now, in this lounge, in this quiet room filled with evidence, strategy, and unassailable truth, he understood the bitterest lesson of all. Some truths cannot be denied. The room was still. Even the guards remained statues, sensing the gravity of the moment, aware that this revelation was not just legal or financial, it was existential. Xavier's chest heaved. Sweat formed faintly at his hairline. Every instinct screamed for countermeasure, for negotiation, for retreat, but none were available. The empire he had relied on for identity and control had been exposed as hollow, built on theft, and now claimed by someone he had underestimated the most. Arthur spoke softly. "Mr. Thorne, this changes everything, not in theory, but in fact, legally, morally, publicly." Xavier's hands trembled. He realized the full scope of his miscalculation. Not only had he lost authority over the child, over the estate, over the art, but he had also lost the narrative, the story he had controlled for decades. Naya adjusted Leo again, ensuring the baby's small body was secure, warm, untouchable by the chaos that surrounded them. "Truth," she said, voice soft yet unyielding, "cannot be silenced. It cannot be erased. It cannot be bought, and it will always outlive deception." Xavier's eyes flicked to Marcus Hale, the silent witness, the enforcer, the man who had watched every move. The realization hit him that even rivals had a code, a morality he had ignored in his arrogance. The weight pressed down on Xavier physically now, every breath sharp, every heartbeat a drum of realization, a drum marking the collapse of the world he had assumed he controlled. Genevieve's sobs began, low, restrained, terrified. She understood finally the futility of trying to salvage control in a room where the real power had quietly, deliberately shifted. Xavier's knees pressed into the velvet, his hands flexed uselessly. His empire was not just questioned, it was undone. His identity, built on deception and pretense, lay exposed, vulnerable, irrevocable. The baby cooed, a small, innocent sound, and in that sound, in that life, Xavier saw what he could never touch again: untainted existence, protected from his arrogance, shielded by the woman he had thought powerless. Xavier realized fully that his legacy, his empire, his carefully constructed identity, all of it had been dismantled by one undeniable fact. Naya held the proof of his deceit, and with it, the power to redefine everything he thought he owned. The room remained heavy with silence, thick like damp velvet after the truth had fallen. Xavier slumped slightly on the sofa, shoulders curved inward, as if the weight of decades compressed into these last few hours. Every muscle in his body felt unfamiliar, tense, aching, hollow. The world he had believed belonged to him now seemed foreign, alien, untouchable. Naya straightened her shoulders, adjusting Leo against her chest. The baby's head rested lightly against her collarbone, eyes half closed, trusting. Every motion she made was deliberate, slow, a rhythm of calm control. Each step was measured, her terracotta dress flowing softly with the movement, brushing lightly against the carpet, making the polished floorboards whisper. Marcus Hale, ever calm, moved to the door. He extended a hand to open it, silently acknowledging Naya's autonomy. He didn't interfere, didn't speak, didn't offer advice. His presence was a quiet reminder of external power, a shield without intrusion. Xavier's eyes flicked up. The Ice King had spent years learning to anticipate, to manipulate, to corner any situation. But now he felt a raw, gnawing desperation, one that had no protocol, no playbook. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, almost foreign. "Naya, please." The word was an echo of every regret he had never admitted. It trembled in the air, fragile and futile. It wasn't a command, it wasn't an attempt at manipulation. It was recognition, vulnerability, and the faint, desperate hope that the past could somehow be undone. Naya paused. She didn't turn. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. Her pause wasn't for him. It wasn't for Xavier. It was for herself, for the small, fragile clarity of triumph that didn't need to be shouted or displayed, for the quiet satisfaction that came from surviving, from planning, from reclaiming what had always been hers to protect. Her voice broke the silence, soft but precise. "I was sweet," she said quietly. Her words carried weight, resonance, finality. "You just never deserved it." The baby stirred, tiny fingers flexing in the gentle rhythm of sleep. Leo's presence anchored the moment, a reminder of innocence untouched by arrogance, by cruelty, by deception. Genevieve's eyes were wide, a mixture of horror and disbelief. She realized that all the schemes, all the plans, all the influence she had counted on had evaporated, leaving her powerless in a room that now belonged to Naya's integrity and foresight. Xavier pressed a hand to the edge of the sofa. He wanted to rise, to follow, to demand explanation, redemption, a second chance, but he couldn't. His pride, shredded and raw, anchored him to the spot. He was no longer the predator in this room. He was the one who had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, outseen. The soft click of the door opening was louder than a gunshot in Xavier's ears. Every step Naya took toward freedom was a reminder of all that he had failed to notice, all that he had underestimated. The quiet shuffle of her heels on the polished floor, the sway of her dress, the protective cradle of Leo. It was a rhythm of inevitability. Marcus followed silently, opening the door fully, letting her passage remain dignified, uninterrupted. He didn't speak, he didn't gesture, he merely ensured that the path of exit was safe and untainted. A subtle nod to the respect owed to power that wasn't flaunted but quietly earned. Xavier's voice cracked again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Naya, you don't understand." She paused, a single deliberate motion. Not for him, not to grant him satisfaction. Her pause was a line drawn in the air, a punctuation mark at the end of the sentence of their shared past. She measured the distance between them in heartbeat lengths and deliberate breaths. "I understand more than you ever could," she said, soft, low, final. Her eyes flicked briefly down to Leo, ensuring he remained safe and untangled from the chaos surrounding them. "And I'm done explaining to someone who never listened." The door closed behind her with a faint, resolute click. The sound resonated in the room like the last note of a symphony, lingering, echoing, undeniable. Xavier sank further into the sofa, one hand falling limply to the carpet. The velvet cushions pressed against his skin, but offered no comfort, no warmth. The world he had built, the legacy, the reputation, the illusions of love and control had left him empty, exposed. Genevieve finally slumped in her own chair, her fingers gripping the armrest. Her gaze was fixed on the closed door, wide-eyed, pale, the reality settling into her chest like an anchor dragging her under. Arthur stood near the table, papers in hand, silently observing the scene. He didn't speak. His expression was neutral, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed acknowledgement of the devastation that had occurred, not of wealth, but of human pride, of expectation, of the illusion of control. Xavier's fingers flexed against the carpet. He wanted to grab, to call, to demand, to negotiate, anything, but there was nothing left to grasp. His empire had been stripped by foresight, patience, and the simple, unyielding power of truth. He glanced at Marcus Hale, standing calmly by the door. The man's presence was a reminder of forces beyond boardrooms and contracts. He represented observation, respect, and an impartial awareness of the consequences of underestimating someone who had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. The soft rustle of the divorce papers, the renunciation of lineage, and the evidence of the stolen artistry still rested on the table. Each was a silent monument to Naya's precision, her planning, and her resolve. Each a reminder of the magnitude of loss Xavier now faced. He remembered the recordings, the files, the legal documents, the silent calculations that had led to this moment, every thread of his strategy, every moment of arrogance, every assumption of power, undone by a woman who had quietly orchestrated her victory, while he had believed himself untouchable. The baby cooed softly, a tiny, perfect sound in the silence. The innocence of that sound pierced the haze of pride and loss in Xavier's mind, cutting through years of misplaced dominance and revealing the emptiness he had created around himself. Xavier's pulse raced, every calculation of control, every expectation of submission, every assumption that he could manipulate outcomes, shattered. He could see Naya's shadow disappearing through the doorway, the terracotta fabric of her dress swaying lightly, a rhythmic signature of dignity and deliberate action. Genevieve whispered something incomprehensible, a hushed, trembling sound, lost beneath the weight of the moment. She understood fully now that her influence was gone, her plans futile, her security unearned. Arthur finally broke the silence with a measured exhale. His eyes swept the room, noting the collapse of arrogance, the exposure of truth, and the subtle yet absolute assertion of power by someone who had been dismissed, underestimated, and silenced for far too long. Xavier lowered his head, his mind spun. He had ruled markets, led men, controlled narratives, and yet here he was, silent, powerless, stripped of authority by the precision of preparation, the weight of foresight, and the sheer force of deliberate moral clarity. The velvet sofa felt heavier under him, the air dense. Every heartbeat thudded against his chest, reminding him of the reality. Naya had won not through confrontation, not through fury, not through overt dominance, but through calm, deliberate, strategic reclamation of what was rightfully hers, and untouchable. He realized slowly, painfully, that this exit, the simple act of leaving, was a declaration. It was not just about departure, it was about freedom, assertion, and the complete dismantling of a world built on arrogance. The soft click of the door sealing Naya and Leo from view reverberated in Xavier's mind, each echo carrying the weight of permanence. She had walked away, not gloating, not triumphant, but utterly unshakable. He swallowed hard, voice lost, pride shattered, mind racing for answers he would never find here. Xavier realized, in the coldest moment of clarity, that he hadn't just lost a wife or a child, he had lost the illusion of control over his own life, and there was no path back into the room where power now belonged to someone he had always underestimated. Months passed like slow tides, each day washing over the city with quiet change. The world that had once revolved around Xavier Thorne's name, the deals, the acquisitions, the opulent image, began to crumble, brick by brick, headline by headline. Newspapers ran his resignation as though it were inevitable, an expected outcome of years of arrogance. Xavier Thorne steps down, empire in turmoil, one headline read. Another declared, Genevieve disappears amid corporate collapse. The words seemed almost perfunctory, but for those who had lived in the shadow of power, the collapse resonated like the crash of a distant storm. Xavier wandered through empty boardrooms, halls that had once echoed with his decisions, his authority, his ego. He touched the polished wood tables, felt the cool marble under his palms, and realized they were no longer his. Every object, every symbol of control now felt alien. The empire he had assumed was indestructible had fractured, splintered by one woman's quiet foresight. He tried to speak to the remaining executives, to assert influence, but his words held no weight. Board members who had once feared his opinion now glanced at him with polite curiosity, a subtle shrug of detachment. They had aligned with truth, not charm. They had recognized strategy, not bluster. Far away in a sunlit studio, a woman laid brush to canvas. The scent of oil paints, turpentine, and raw linen filled the room, mingling with the gentle warmth of sunlight that poured through large, unshaded windows. Her hands moved with precision, with memory, with soul. Each stroke carried a story of years endured, of silence born, of resilience cultivated in quiet moments no one else had noticed. Naya paused for a moment, stepping back from the canvas. Leo laughed nearby, tiny feet pattering across the wooden floor. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged space, pure and untamed, untouched by corporate deals or social pretense. She breathed deeply, letting the sunlight fall across her brown skin, her terracotta dress draped casually, effortlessly, no longer armor, but a statement of freedom. She signed her work with a new name. Deliberate, untraceable, untethered. It was not a pseudonym, it was a declaration, a reclamation. This was her identity, her art, her life. No one else had a claim, no one else had a say. Every canvas, every line, every shadow was hers alone. Meanwhile, Xavier's phone buzzed incessantly, calls from lawyers, remaining investors, reporters. He ignored them. None of it mattered. None of it mattered. The power he had clung to had been stripped, not violently but inevitably, by the truth he had ignored, by the patience he had underestimated, by the presence of a woman who understood consequence far more than he had understood ego. Genevieve, too, vanished from the world of socialites and corporate gatherings. Her name was whispered in corridors, speculated about in tabloids, but no one could locate her. Without Xavier's empire, without the structure she had counted on, she had become a ghost, a footnote in a story that had moved on without her. Xavier sat alone one evening, staring out of his Manhattan apartment window at the skyline he had once dominated. Lights glittered across the city like tiny jewels, indifferent to his despair. He had everything he had ever claimed to want, yet he felt hollow, untethered, irrelevant. Each building, each office, each street was a reminder of what he had lost. Not money, not titles, not influence, but control over the story of his life. He remembered the red light on Naya's recording device, the folders on the table, the calm assertion of authority she had displayed, the way she had held Leo close while dismantling the empire he had built on manipulation. He realized he had never truly understood her, not her mind, not her strength, not the depth of the quiet power she wielded. Far from the chaos, Naya moved across her studio, adjusting a canvas with Leo's laughter echoing softly around her. Marcus Hale had remained in the background, ensuring the smooth transition, the protection of legal processes, but he never interfered. He was a silent sentinel of consequence, a witness to justice served without spectacle, without drama. Naya's eyes lingered on her work. Each painting carried the memory of her resilience, of every moment she had been dismissed, silenced, underestimated. She had poured her life into creation, into reclamation, into the meticulous weaving of a future that Xavier could never touch. Leo's tiny hand reached for the edge of a palette. Naya guided him gently, laughing softly. Each coo, each giggle was a thread of life, untainted, unclaimed, uncorrupted by ambition or pride. For the first time, she could breathe fully, without fear, without compromise. Back in Manhattan, Xavier's reflection stared back at him from a darkened glass. He saw the same sharp jawline, the same piercing blue eyes, but the arrogance, the confidence, the Ice King's mask had melted away. He was exposed, vulnerable, reduced to the bare elements of a man who had believed he could control everything, only to discover that control was an illusion. He remembered the paintings, the renunciation of lineage, the recording of his own words. Every claim, every boast, every manipulation was now evidence against him, irrevocable, unchangeable. And for the first time, he understood what Naya had always known. Power without integrity is fleeting. Influence without respect is meaningless. He tried to call her once, a single desperate message, but the phone felt cold, heavy, meaningless. Naya's world existed outside his reach, outside his schemes, outside the grasp of the man who had once believed he could own her. Naya set down a brush, Leo climbing into her lap. She held him close, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the warmth of life that was untouched by greed, untouched by manipulation. She whispered softly, a vow to herself and to him. Freedom, creation, safety. A life unclaimed by past shadows. The studio smelled of paint and sunlight, ordinary yet sacred. For months she had moved quietly, invisibly, building a life that was hers alone. And now, at last, she could live it openly, unapologetically. Xavier's empire crumbled further in news reports, headlines screaming of fractured assets, resignations, and failed mergers. He read them in silence, numb, unmoored. Each article a hammer striking against the foundation of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Naya stepped back from her work. The canvas reflected a story of pain, strategy, survival, and triumph. She smiled faintly, not for vanity, but for the quiet acknowledgement of victory hard won and life reclaimed. Leo laughed, sunlight catching the strands of his hair. Each sound was a reminder that life continued, that joy was not contingent on money or status, that freedom was tangible, beautiful, and real. Marcus Hale watched from a distance, a quiet nod of approval. He had been a guardian of consequences, a witness to careful reclamation. His presence was silent, unobtrusive, but it ensured that the world Naya had built remained untouched by lingering threats. Xavier remained in his apartment, staring out, powerless to reclaim any part of what had been his illusion of control. He realized fully, finally, that a name, money, and influence were hollow if the human heart and conscience were absent. Naya finally put down the brush. She held Leo, watching sunlight dance across his tiny features. The room was quiet, safe, a new world built on deliberate action, patience, and resilience. She had reclaimed her identity, her art, her life. The renunciation of lineage had not been an act of spite, it had been an assertion of self, and it was complete. The city moved on outside. Headlines faded, reports disappeared. Yet inside the sunlit studio, a woman and her child laughed, breathed, lived freely. Naya whispered to Leo, a vow wrapped in warmth, sunlight, and promise. No one will take this from us. Ever. She looked at her canvases, at her new name signed on each, and for the first time in years, she felt untethered, whole, and unassailable. The world she had entered months ago, a world of betrayal, manipulation, and hollow power, was gone, replaced by a life of intention, creativity, and uncompromised love. And somewhere, far away, Xavier realized that some victories could never be reclaimed, some truths could never be reversed, some lives were no longer his to touch. The sunlight fell across Naya's studio, Leo's laughter mingling with the scent of paint and freedom, and for the first time she understood a life built on truth, patience, and deliberate courage cannot be taken by man, by empire, or by arrogance. The Ice King had fallen, and the queen of her own world was finally free.